The desert does not care who you are. In 1851, a family crossed land they believed was empty, but the silence was watching. By sunrise, the wagon was shattered, the dead left where they fell, and 2 girls were not rescued. They were chosen. This is not a frontier legend. This is not a story of chaos or savagery. It is a system documented, deliberate, and designed to transform human beings. Tonight, you will hear what captivity actually meant, why some women survived by becoming someone else, and why history learned to look away. This is the truth buried beneath the myths of the American frontier. The sand still remembers. The desert doesn't scream. When blood spills, it absorbs. A wagon train thinks it's crossing empty land and discovers a homeland at war. In the aftermath, 2 girls are not rescued. They are selected. March 14, 1851, Arizona Territory. The sun has already fallen behind the distant ridges, but the ground still holds heat like a living thing. A young woman lies face down in the sand, with a wound in her scalp and dust in her mouth, and her body has reached the strange point where pain becomes background noise. Her name is Mary Ann Oatman. She is 17. 2 hours ago, she was a daughter in a moving world of canvas, wood, and prayer parents ahead, siblings laughing or complaining, the wagon creaking toward California like a promise. Now the promise is broken into pieces across a quarter mile. Shredded cloth, spilled flour, shattered barrels, and the terrible stillness that follows efficient violence. Her father tried to bargain. That was his mistake. Bargains require shared rules, and the people who came out of the desert were not here to negotiate a traveler's dream. She heard the crack of a war club, like a door slamming shut on a future that will never return, saw her mother fall beside him, saw brothers scatter and vanish into dust and shouting. And Mary Ann, still alive, learns the first law of this frontier. Survival is not awarded for innocence. It is calculated by usefulness. Around her, voices move through the wreckage with methodical purpose. Not the chaos settlers imagine when they say raid. These men have done this before. They know what to take, what to burn, and what to leave behind. They are not harvesting only goods. They are harvesting outcomes. Somewhere nearby, Olive 15 cries out, and little Mary Ann 7 makes a sound too small for the world she has entered. Lorenzo, wounded, groans in the sand like a man already half buried. The warriors do not rush to kill him. They do something colder. They decide he is not worth the effort. And Mary Ann Oatman, fading in and out, does not yet understand the cruel arithmetic taking place over her family's bodies, because this is not a random act. It is a system older than the wagon trails, older than the maps that called this place blank. The people Americans call Apache are not one single nation, but many bands and groups living inside a long war of pressure and survival, where losses must be replaced, work must be done, and trade must continue even when the world is burning at the edges. Captives, especially women and children, can become labor, currency, or family depending on what the band needs, depending on what the captive can endure, depending on who the captive becomes under force. That is why the selection is the beginning of the story, not the end of it. The warriors look at the survivors the way a butcher looks at cuts of meat, without drama, without cruelty for its own sake, but with a clarity that feels like cruelty to those who have never seen war lived as routine. Adult men are danger. Wounded bodies are cost. Very young children are fragile. But a girl of 15? Old enough to work. Young enough to be reshaped. A child of 7? Young enough to be absorbed like clay before it hardens. The desert does not teach mercy. It teaches continuity. And in a world where every winter can starve you and every enemy can erase you, the captivity system becomes a kind of dark technology, one that converts enemy life into Apache advantage. The Oatmans did not know that. They believed they were passing through. But no one passes through a homeland during a war and stays untouched. That is the difference between a traveler's story and a frontier's reality. The land remembers who belongs to it, and it punishes those who pretend it is empty. As the last light drains from the sky, the warriors gather what remains. Olive and little Marianne are pulled upright, their terror loud against the quiet efficiency around them. Their clothing is already being judged, too heavy, too foreign for the march ahead. The wagon is stripped, the dead are ignored, the living are reorganized. A few small hands clutch each other, and in that gesture lives an old human instinct. If we stay together, we might remain ourselves. But captivity does not begin with chains. It begins with movement. The first stage is always the same. Take them away so fast that grief can't become a plan, so far that rescue becomes a myth. And when Olive looks back one last time, she doesn't just see the wreckage of her family. She sees the edge of a world closing behind her. The desert takes its witnesses. The night takes its silence. And the men leading her away are already testing something in her, watching how she walks, how she cries, how she obeys, because the next question is not whether she will live. The next question is what they will make her into. The march that erases names, the journey begins before grief can settle into memory. Feet bleed, voices crack, and the desert becomes a test that decides who deserves to arrive. This march is not travel, it is selection in motion. They are forced to move almost immediately, not given the mercy of night or the dignity of burying the dead, because Apache raiding doctrine does not pause for mourning. Speed is safety. Speed is dominance. Olive Oatman stumbles forward with her sister clutched to her side. The smaller girl steps uneven, her breath already coming in short, frightened pulls. The warriors set a pace meant to exhaust even themselves, a brutal rhythm that stretches time into something shapeless and punishing. This is not cruelty born of anger. It is deliberate pressure, applied early, because the march is the first filter. Anyone who cannot keep up will not be carried. Anyone who collapses will not be encouraged. Anyone who becomes a burden will be erased where they fall, absorbed into the sand without ceremony. Olive understands this without being told. She feels it in the way the men watch her feet, in the way no one looks back when her wounded brother's groans fade into silence. The desert teaches its lesson fast. Survival here is not about fairness, only endurance. Water is rationed just enough to prevent collapse. Food is barely given at all. Pain is allowed to accumulate because pain reveals character. The warriors are watching not only bodies, but reactions. Who cries? Who begs? Who resists? Who adapts? The march is not simply moving captives from one place to another. It is transforming them from people into problems that must solve themselves or be removed. By the second day, Olive's shoes are gone, taken because they slow her, replaced with rough moccasins that do not fit and do not forgive. Her feet split open, and every step leaves something behind. The little girl beside her cannot maintain the pace for long. Olive lifts her when she can, carries her until her arms tremble, then sets her down again before the shaking becomes visible. Weakness invites attention. Attention invites consequence. She learns to make suffering quiet. The blows come without warning, not furious, not wild, but corrective, like tools used to shape wood. A pause too long earns a strike. A stumble earns another. Not enough to cripple, only enough to instruct. This calibrated violence is part of the system. A dead captive is useless. A terrified one is manageable. At night they are bound, not because escape is likely, but because the act of binding teaches dependency. The ropes say the same thing the march says, your body is no longer yours. Sleep comes in fragments, haunted by thirst and the sound of breathing that might stop at any moment. Olive listens to her sister's breath, the way a priest listens for confession, because if that sound disappears, she knows exactly what will happen next. No tears, no pause. The line will keep moving. As days blur together, the captive's language begins to die first. English words become pointless here. They carry no power. Commands are delivered in sharp syllables that Olive does not yet understand, but meaning arrives through repetition and pain. This is how identity begins to thin. Names are not used. Eye contact is discouraged. The captives are referred to with gestures, with sounds that reduce them to function. Even time changes shape. There is no tomorrow in captivity, only the next moment you must survive. Hunger sharpens thought into a single narrow blade. Keep walking. The desert participates in the breaking. Heat presses down during the day, cold bites at night, and the land itself seems aligned with the captors, offering no shelter, no mercy, no illusion that help exists beyond the horizon. Olive feels something inside her reorganize, like furniture being thrown out of a burning house. Fear becomes useful. Curiosity becomes dangerous. Obedience becomes currency. She learns to read faces quickly, to sense when attention turns toward her, to disappear into the rhythm of movement. This is not surrender. It is adaptation, and adaptation is what captivity rewards. When they finally reach the edge of an Apache camp, days later, the girls are barely recognizable as the people who left the wagon. Their hair is matted with dust and blood, their bodies thinner, their eyes already quieter. The march has done its work. They have arrived not as grieving children, but as raw material. The camp does not erupt in celebration or chaos. It absorbs them the way a machine absorbs new components. Women look them over with expressions that mix contempt and calculation. Children stare, curious and unafraid. Elders observe without comment. The warriors release the ropes and step back, their job complete for now. The girls are no longer moving, but the process has not stopped. The march has erased distance. The next stage will erase something far more dangerous, the memory of who they were allowed to think they were. And as Olive tightens her grip on her sister's hand, she does not yet know that this small active connection is already being measured, already being judged, because in this place, even love can become a liability that must be broken. The camp of quiet eyes. No chains are needed when everyone is watching. In this place, silence weighs more than iron. The captives are no longer chased, they are studied. The Apache camp does not feel like a prison, and that is what makes it terrifying. There are no walls, no visible barriers, no shouted orders echoing through corridors. Instead, there is space open ground, cooking fires, shelters arranged with practiced logic, and within that space, a constant awareness that nothing goes unseen. Olive and her little sister are guided into the camp and released, not set free, but placed. Their ropes are removed, yet their bodies remain tense, waiting for punishment that does not come. This absence of immediate violence is not mercy. It is the next phase of control. In captivity, unpredictability is power. The girls quickly realize that they are no longer treated as enemies, nor yet as people. They are something in between objects of evaluation. Women approach them first, older, efficient, their expressions hard, not with hatred, but with indifference. Hands examine arms, backs, legs, checking muscle, checking health, checking whether the journey has broken anything that cannot be repaired. Words pass over the girls in a language they do not understand, but tone carries meaning well enough. Olive feels the heat of appraisal the way one feels sunlight through closed eyelids. She understands instinctively that every reaction she shows is being recorded. Cry too much and you are weak. Resist and you are troublesome. Go quiet and you might survive. Work begins immediately, because labor reveals more than questions ever could. Olive and her sister are pushed toward tasks that require no explanation: hauling water, gathering firewood, scraping hides until their hands ache. This is not simple exploitation. It is observation through exhaustion. Can they follow gestures? Can they imitate what they see? Can they learn quickly enough to be useful? Food comes irregularly, sometimes generous, sometimes withheld. And Olive notices how this unpredictability sharpens her focus until she lives entirely inside the present moment. Hunger becomes a leash. Rest becomes a reward. Around them, the camp moves on with its own rhythms, children playing, men repairing tools, women preparing food as if the girls are barely present. This is another lesson. They are visible, but they do not belong. They are reminded of this every time laughter passes near them without including them, every time a conversation shifts when they approach. Belonging is something that must be earned here, and even then, it may never fully arrive. Days stretch into weeks, and the testing never stops. The girls are separated often, not permanently, but just enough to remind them that their bond is fragile. Isolation works quietly, like water wearing down stone. Olive learns that speaking English brings consequences, not always immediate, not always violent, but enough to teach her that her old language is dangerous. Names are never used. Instead, there are sounds, gestures, words that describe function rather than identity. The erasure is subtle but relentless. Hair is cut, clothing replaced with rough garments that mark them as captives. Every external sign of their former lives is stripped away, not in a single traumatic act, but piece by piece, until memory itself feels unstable. Olive finds herself thinking in fragments, measuring time by meals and tasks rather than days. This is not accidental. A person who cannot anchor themselves to a past is easier to reshape. The little sister adapts differently. Being younger, she absorbs faster, mimics sounds without understanding their loss, follows instructions with the pliable instinct of a child who senses that survival depends on pleasing adults. Olive watches this with a mix of relief and dread. Adoption is a possibility here. So is trade. So is death. The camp is not cruel in the way frontier stories imagine, but it is relentless in a way those stories never explain. Every captive is being sorted, quietly, constantly, into categories that will decide their future. Those who work well, who show obedience without too much spirit, are noted. Those who resist too fiercely are corrected. Those who cannot keep up simply fade, transferred or discarded without ceremony. At night, Olive listens to the sounds of the camp and realizes that she is no longer afraid of immediate death. That fear has been replaced by something colder, the fear of being changed beyond recognition. About a year passes in this suspended state, long enough for seasons to cycle, long enough for the girls to become familiar shapes within the camp's routines. And then the tone shifts. Conversations happen just out of earshot. Eyes linger longer. There is talk of movement, of preparation. The girls are cleaned, fed better, examined more carefully. This is not kindness. It is valuation. Olive does not yet understand the full meaning of this attention, but she feels the ground move beneath her in a way that feels final. Because the assessment is ending. A decision has been made. And soon, the girls will learn whether they are to be absorbed into this world or handed over like goods to another, where the rules will be different, but the captivity will remain. The trade that changes everything, no farewell, is given when ownership changes. Human lives are weighed like goods, not mourned like losses. What survives the march now faces a colder judgment. The moment of transfer arrives without ceremony, because ceremony is for things that matter emotionally, and this exchange is governed by value alone. Olive and her sister are led away from the Apache camp at dawn, not bound this time, not beaten, not even rushed, and that calm is what terrifies Olive most. She has learned by now that violence is not the most dangerous tool in captivity. Certainty is. The warriors escorting them move with purpose, carrying trade goods, weapons, and supplies, traveling toward the riverlands where the Mojave live, a people with different customs, different beliefs, and a different logic of captivity. The journey feels shorter than the first march, not because it is easier, but because Olive no longer measures distance in hope. She measures it in outcomes. She understands now that survival does not mean return. It means continuation under new rules. When they arrive, The exchange happens like any other trade. Words pass between men who already understand the terms. Goods are inspected. The girls are examined again, their health noted, their age calculated, their usefulness silently assessed. Olive feels the moment when her life shifts hands not with a rope, but with a glance and a nod. Ownership changes without her consent, without her voice, without any recognition that she is witnessing the second death of her old world. The Mojave camp is different, more settled, closer to water, marked by agriculture and permanence rather than constant movement. This difference brings no immediate relief. It brings confusion. The girls are marked almost immediately, their chins tattooed with dark lines that burn as they are carved into the skin. This is not punishment. It is identification. The marks declare affiliation, status, and transformation. For Mojave women, such tattoos are part of cultural belonging. For captives, they are proof that something irreversible has happened. Olive understands this the moment the needle lifts and blood mixes with ink. Even if she escapes, even if she returns, this mark will speak for her forever. Her sister receives the same treatment, crying until exhaustion silences her, and Olive feels something inside her harden not against the pain, but against the future. The tattoos are not meant to hurt the body alone. They are meant to settle the question of who you are allowed to be. Life among the Mojave unfolds differently. The younger sister, still malleable, is absorbed more gently, placed with a family that feeds her, teaches her language, assigns her tasks that feel almost ordinary. This is how adoption begins, not with love, but with routine. Olive's position is more ambiguous. Too old to forget, too young to be discarded, she exists in a space between slave and kin, given food and shelter, but never allowed to forget that her place is conditional. She works constantly, learns quickly, listens more than she speaks. She becomes fluent in the rhythms of survival here, learning when to comply, when to withdraw, when to make herself useful without attracting attention. Years pass this way, marked not by calendars, but by seasons of scarcity and abundance. When food is plentiful, life almost resembles stability. When famine strikes, captives suffer first. Bodies weaken. The fragile die. The younger sister does not survive this hunger. Her death is quiet, absorbed into the broader suffering of the community. And Olive is not allowed the luxury of open grief. Loss, she has learned, must be carried silently, or it will cost you more. By the time word reaches American authorities that a white woman with tattooed markings lives among the Mojave, Olive has been gone for 5 years. She is no longer the girl taken from the wagon. She speaks the language of her captors. She understands their customs. She has learned to endure without expecting rescue. When soldiers finally arrive to negotiate her release, she does not run to them. She hesitates. This hesitation will later be misunderstood, judged, rewritten into convenient narratives. But hesitation makes sense to anyone who understands captivity. Rescue does not undo transformation. It initiates another one. When Olive is taken back, clothed, fed, and returned to a world that insists she is saved, she carries the Mojave marks on her face and the Apache discipline in her bones. The trade has ended. The captivity has not. Because what was done to her was never meant to be temporary. And as she steps back into white society, she does not yet know that the hardest judgment she will face is not from warriors or captors, but from the people who demand she be exactly who she was before, as if history can be erased as easily as ownership once changed hands. The return that does not save you. Rescue ends captivity, but not its consequences. The body comes home marked, and the mind follows more slowly. Some transformations refuse to be undone. When Olive Oatman is finally brought back into American-controlled territory in 1856, she is not greeted as a person returning from war, but as a symbol that must be explained. Soldiers escort her as if she were both victim and evidence, her tattooed chin drawing eyes before words ever do. The marks that once signaled affiliation now signal something far more dangerous in white society difference. People stare openly. Some whisper. Others ask questions they pretend are polite. What happened to you? What did they do to you? Were you still one of us while you were gone? Olive learns quickly that rescue has rules, and the first rule is that she must perform gratitude. She must speak of suffering in ways that confirm what her audience already believes about the frontier. She must not speak of adaptation or attachment or the strange calm that sometimes replaced fear. Those truths make listeners uncomfortable. They blur the simple line between savage and civilized that people want the past to draw for them. So Olive learns a new survival skill editing herself. Her reintegration is managed carefully by ministers, officials, and writers who understand the power of narrative. A captivity story is arranged, dictated, shaped for public consumption. It emphasizes brutality, faith under pressure, and divine rescue, because these are the themes that sell books and soothe consciences. And yet, even within this controlled telling, the reality leaks through. Olive struggles to remember English words that once came easily. She reacts sharply to certain sounds. Crowds exhaust her. Silence feels safer than conversation. She cannot explain why she sometimes misses the riverlands, why she dreams in another language, why the world she returned to feels just as foreign as the one she left behind. There is no vocabulary for this in 19th century America. Trauma is not recognized as an injury. Transformation is treated as contamination. The unspoken question hangs over every interaction. How much of her captivity remains inside her? Marriage is supposed to resolve this. Normalcy is prescribed like medicine. Olive marries, lives quietly, fulfills expected roles, but the marks on her face never fade. Children stare. Adults look away. The tattoos follow her into every room like shadows that refuse to detach. They are proof that something happened that cannot be fully explained or erased. Olive gives lectures for a time, standing before audiences who listen in horrified fascination, but the act of retelling costs her more each time. She withdraws eventually, choosing privacy over performance, because speaking about captivity keeps her inside it. And yet silence does not free her either. The past remains present, not as memory alone, but as habit, instinct, and reflex. She has learned how to endure hunger, how to read danger quickly, how to survive under authority that does not care about fairness. These lessons do not disappear simply because the uniform of authority changes. Olive's story is often told as an ending. A girl is taken. A woman returns. The frontier moves on. But this framing hides the deeper truth revealed by other captives who did not fit the narrative so neatly. Some women returned and could not reintegrate at all. Military records describe recovered captives who could no longer speak English fluently, who resisted leaving their captors, who had formed families and identities within indigenous communities. These women were often described as confused or deranged, not because they were broken beyond repair, but because society had no space for people who existed between worlds. A woman who had learned to survive captivity by adapting had violated an unspoken rule. She was supposed to remain unchanged in spirit, even while her body endured everything. Those who failed this impossible standard were quietly institutionalized, silenced, or erased from the historical record. The return, for many, became a second captivity, one governed by shame rather than fear, by expectation rather than violence. White society demanded clear answers to questions that had no clean solutions. Did you resist enough? Did you remain pure? Did you suffer in the right way? These judgments were rarely spoken aloud, but they shaped lives just as surely as ropes and blows once had. Olive carries this weight for decades, living a life that appears stable from the outside while remaining unresolved within. When she dies in 1903, much of her private writing is destroyed, leaving historians with gaps that cannot be filled. What remains are the visible marks, the public narrative, and the quiet evidence that captivity did not end when she crossed back into American land. The frontier prefers stories with closure. Rescue satisfies that desire. But the experiences of women like Olive reveal something far more unsettling, that captivity reshapes identity in ways that no return can fully reverse. And as the nation moves forward, building myths of progress and destiny, it chooses to forget this uncomfortable truth. Because acknowledging it would mean admitting that survival sometimes requires becoming someone else. And that is a reality history has never known how to forgive. What history chose to bury, the past does not disappear, it is rearranged. Some truths are not erased, only hidden beneath safer stories. This is the part history learned not to tell. The story of women in Apache captivity did not end with Olive Oatman's return, nor with her quiet death decades later. It ended much later, when American history decided which versions of the frontier were acceptable to remember and which were too unsettling to keep intact. What survived were simplified legends, savage raids, innocent victims, heroic rescues, because those narratives preserved moral clarity. What was buried were the systems, the logic, the uncomfortable reality that captivity was not chaos, but structure, not madness, but method. The records that tell this story still exist, scattered across captivity narratives, military correspondence, anthropological notes, and archaeological traces, but they are rarely read together. When they are, a darker picture emerges. Captivity was not an interruption of life. It was an alternate path of human organization that forced women to adapt or perish. And adaptation, not resistance alone, was often the key to survival. The Apache captivity system was not unique in human history. Similar practices existed across ancient and medieval societies, wherever prolonged conflict demanded replacement, labor, or leverage. What makes this system disturbing is not its brutality alone, but its effectiveness. It reshaped people. It erased and rebuilt identity using exhaustion, isolation, controlled violence, and conditional belonging. Modern psychology would recognize these techniques immediately, but in the 19th century, they were misunderstood or moralized away. Women who adapted were viewed with suspicion. Women who broke were hidden. Women who survived too well disrupted the comforting boundary between victim and enemy. So history adjusted the frame. It emphasized suffering while minimizing transformation. It focused on rescue while ignoring what rescue could not undo. Archaeology confirms what the written sources struggle to explain. Excavations of Apache and Mojave sites reveal material culture that does not belong objects of European origin, clothing fragments, tools used differently than their makers intended. Skeletal remains show healed injuries consistent with long-term captivity rather than quick death. Tattoos, scars, altered bone stress patterns, all physical records of lives lived under constraint. These are not legends. They are evidence. And together, they tell us that women in captivity were not simply held. They were processed, sorted, and repurposed within systems that valued continuity over mercy. Some became laborers, some became wives, some became mothers. Some became trade goods, some lost their minds, some lost their lives. And some returned, carrying the unbearable burden of having survived by becoming someone else. Mary Ann Oatman, the 17-year-old left to die in the sand, represents the countless names we never learn. She did not survive long enough to be transformed, but her death marks the boundary between two worlds, one that believed the frontier was empty, and one that knew it was fiercely defended. Olive Oatman, marked for life, represents the ambiguity history struggles with most. She was both victim and adapter, both captive and participant in a system that reshaped her. Her tattoos were not symbols of shame or savagery. They were proof of survival within a structure that did not care about her original identity. And that is why her story remains uncomfortable. It refuses to stay simple. In the end, the unspeakable part of Apache captivity is not only what was done to women, but what survival demanded of them. Fear, greed, insecurity, shock, broken belief, and constant challenge were not just emotions. They were tools wielded by history itself. Curiosity about these stories has always existed, but it has been dulled by myth. Grim history begins where myth ends. It asks not who is good or evil, but what humans are capable of building when survival becomes sacred and morality becomes flexible. The frontier was not a place of clean lines and clear heroes. It was a collision of worlds, and women stood at its most vulnerable edge. Their stories were never meant to be remembered this clearly, but the land remembers. The records remain. And once you see the system beneath the suffering, the past can no longer pretend it was accidental.